I woke up with a pounding headache, my body drenched in sweat. The heat wave that had smothered our small town was relentless, and that day, I'd spent hours clearing debris from my yard after a freak windstorm. I hadn't eaten much, just a protein bar and some water, and the sweltering sun had drained whatever energy I had left. It was late afternoon when I started to feel dizzy. The edges of my vision blurred as I stumbled towards the porch. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding erratically. The last thing I remember was the world tilting sideways as I collapsed onto the steps. Then came the darkness, but it wasn't the restful, unconscious kind of dark. It was heavy and oppressive, almost alive. I felt like I was floating in it, weightless, but with the undeniable sense of being watched. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. And then I saw him. He emerged from the darkness like a faint outline at first, a man suspended in the sky above me. His form grew clearer, his features sharpening into something too perfect, too symmetrical to be human. He wore a white suit that shimmered unnaturally, as though made of light. His eyes were piercing blue, glowing faintly, and his smile was disarmingly kind. "Come with me," he said, his voice calm, almost melodic. I couldn't respond. My body was frozen. My heart was racing. He extended a hand towards me, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. "No," I managed to croak, my voice weak and unsteady. He smiled again, but this time it felt wrong, like a parent placating a disobedient child. "You've done enough," he said softly. "It's time to let go." I started to panic. The world around me seemed to shift and warp. I could see faint glimpses of my own body lying limp on the porch below. Paramedics surrounding me, shouting commands I couldn't hear. But I was here, in this dark void with him. "I'm not ready," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. He tilted his head, studying me like I was an anomaly he couldn't have accounted for. His hand was still outstretched, waiting. "It's not about readiness," he said. "It's about acceptance. Take my hand, and there will be peace. No more pain, and no more fear." I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. His presence seemed to fill the void, suffocating and inescapable. Then I felt it, a pull, subtle at first but growing stronger. It was as if an invisible thread connected me to him, drawing me upward, toward his open hand. "No," I shouted, finding strength I didn't know I had. I pushed back up against the pull, fighting with every ounce of my will. His expression darkened, his calm demeanor replaced with something colder, more menacing. His smile disappeared, and for the first time, his voice lost its melodic quality. "You can't resist forever," he said. "This is the way it ends." I was screaming now, thrashing against the unseen force that dragged me closer to him. My fingers clawed at nothing, desperate to anchor myself. And then I felt something else, a warmth, faint but familiar. It was coming from below, from my body. I focused on it, clinging it to a lifeline. The pull from above weakened, the connection fraying. "No," he roared, his voice echoing through the void. His hand lunged towards me, desperate to seal the deal. But I was falling, spiraling downward, back towards the warmth, the light, the sound of frantic voices. I gasped awake, choking on air as I bolted upright. The paramedics stared at me, wide-eyed, their relief palatable. "You were gone for a minute," one of them said, his voice shaking. "We almost lost you." I couldn't speak, couldn't explain what I just experienced, but I knew deep down that it wasn't just a hallucination or a nightmare. Somewhere out there, or up there, that a man was still waiting, still watching, his hand forever extended. And one day, I'd have to face him again. I spent the night in the hospital. The heat stroke had pushed my body to the brink. Dehydration, organ stress, and a dangerously low blood pressure. The doctor said I was lucky to be even alive. I nodded numbly as they talked, but I wasn't listening. My mind kept circling back to him. The man in the sky. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his hand reaching out, beckoning me. His voice echoed in my ears, soft and unyielding. This is the way it ends. By the time morning came, I was discharged with a strict set of instructions. Hydrate, avoid exertion, and monitor my vitals. My brother Matt picked me up from the University of Michigan Hospital in Ann Arbor, where I had been admitted. "You look like hell," he said, as I climbed into his car. Thanks," I muttered, staring out the window as we drove back into my house. The streets of Ypsilanti blurred past, familiar but distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. "Seriously, though," Matt pressed, glancing at me. "What happened? You were fine when I saw you last week." I hesitated. How could I even explain something I barely understood? "I think I saw something," I said, finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Matt frowned. "Like what?" I hesitated again, then told him everything. The heat stroke, the darkness, the man in the sky, his voice, his hand, the pole. By the time I finished, we were parked in my driveway, and Matt was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "That sounds like a near-death experience," he said slowly. "Maybe," I replied, though the word felt hollow. This was more than just a hallucination or a trick of my oxygen-deprived brain. It felt real. The days that followed were quiet but unsettling. I did everything the doctors told me, drank water like my life depended on it, and stayed indoors as much as possible. But the sense of being watched never left me. It started with little things. I'd see shadows out of the corner of my eye that disappeared when I turned to look. At night, I'd hear faint whispers, almost like the rustling of leaves, except there was no breeze. Then came the dreams. They weren't like normal dreams. They were vivid, hyper-realistic, and always the same. I'd find myself standing in a wide, empty field under a sky that seemed impossibly vast. And there he was, floating just above the horizon, his hand outstretched. "Come with me," he'd say, his voice as calm and melodic as before. Each time, I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat. I started doing research, desperate for answers. I read articles about near-death experiences, stories of people who claim to have seen heaven, hell, or something in between. But none of them described what I'd seen. No tunnels, no deceased loved ones waiting to greet me. Just him. I reached out to a professor at Eastern Michigan University who specialized in religious studies. Dr. Laura had written extensively about a death and the afterlife in various cultures, and I hoped she could provide some insight. When I described my experience, she listened intently, her expression unreadable. "There are accounts," she said finally, "of entities appearing during near-death experiences. Some people interpret them as angels, others as grim reapers. But your description, it doesn't fit neatly into any category." "What does that mean?" I asked, my stomach nodding. "It means," she said carefully, "you may have encountered something unique, or something very old." Her words haunted me as much as the dreams. What did she mean by old? Was he some kind of spirit, an angel, or something else entirely? Then about a week later, something happened that really shook me to my core. It was late at night, and I was sitting on the couch, trying to distract myself with a documentary about near-death experiences. My phone buzzed with a text from Matt. "Hey, are you okay?" I frowned and typed back, "Yeah, why?" His response came almost immediately. "I just had a dream about you. There was a man in the sky, and he was calling your name. He told me to tell you not to fight him next time." My hands started to shake. "Next time?" I typed back, my heart pounding. Matt didn't reply. When I called him, the line went straight to voicemail. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove back to his house in Saline. He looked pale, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with something tense and guarding. "I don't know what's going on," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But that dream, it felt like real. Like he was there." We stared at each other, both of us too scared to say what we were really thinking. What if he was just more than just a dream? What if he was coming back? From that day forward, I lived with the constant fear that my brush with death wasn't over. I started carrying a notebook with me, jotting down every strange occurrence, every dream, every whisper in the night. Because deep down, I knew the truth. One day I'd have to face him again, and this time, I might not be able to say no. Back in 1982, when I was stationed at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri for basic training, I shared a room with 7 other recruits. The schedule was strict, and by 8:30 p.m., every night the lights were out. Conversation often turned to trivial topics, and in one of those mundane moments, I asked my favorite question: "Have you ever had anything really weird happen to you?" The room felt quiet. Most of the guys looked at me like I had just sprouted a 7th head. A few grumbled for me to shut up, and someone said, "Go to sleep." I dropped it and settled in for the night. Hours later, I was shaken awake. Private Wingard stood by my bunk, his face pale and drawn, flickering fluorescent hallway light casting odd shadows on his features. "You asked that question earlier," he whispered, glancing nervously at the other bunks. "I waited until everyone was asleep to tell you. I didn't want them to think I was crazy." The raw intensity in his eyes jolted me fully awake. "What happened?" I asked, sitting up. Wingard hesitated before leaning in close. His voice dropped to an almost inseparable murmur. "The chessboard. Before joining the military, Wingard lived at home with his parents. Their house was old with creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and a basement that always seemed colder than it should have been, no matter the season. One summer evening, he began, I was home alone. My parents were out playing bridge, and my siblings were scattered with friends. I was bored out of my mind, so I went down to the basement to kill time. At the foot of the basement stairs stood a stereo rack, and on top of it, a chessboard with cheap plastic pieces. Wingard decided to entertain himself by staging a battle between good and evil. The white pieces represented good, with the king as God, while the black pieces embodied evil, with the king as the devil. The forces of evil were crushing the forces of good, Wingard explained, his voice tinged with uneasiness. One by one, the black pieces knocked the white pieces off the board, until only the white king was left. Wingard picked up the black king, a triumphant grin on his face, and hovered it over the white king. That's when it happened, he said, his voice shaking. The chessboard began to tremble. at first subtly, then violently. Pieces flew off in all directions, scattering across the room as if propelled by invisible force. Before Wingard could react, a blast of hot, suffocating air roared down the basement stairs, knocking him backward. "I almost kept the basement door shut," he said, his voice cracking. But that night, it was wide open. Terrified, Wingard bolted up the stairs, burst out of the house, and waited in the yard until his parents returned. When they arrived, he told them what had happened. His father, a no-nonsense man, brushed it off as a figment of his overimaginative imagination. The next day, Wingard threw the chessboard and all the pieces into the trash. But it didn't end there, he whispered. A few years before the chessboard incident, Wingard's grandmother had lived with the family. She had been bedridden for years, confined to her room as her health steadily declined. Despite her fertility, she had always cherished the yellow dress that she hadn't been able to wear for years. When she passed, Wingard said, "We buried her in that dress. It was her favorite." His younger siblings, too young to attend the funeral, stayed home with a babysitter. They barely remember their grandmother, having known her as a shadow of her former self. The night after the funeral, Wingard continued, "My little brother and sister woke up in the middle of the night. At breakfast the next morning, they sat at the table with wide, excited eyes. 'Grandma came to see us,' they exclaimed. Their parents, touched by the innocence of childhood imagination, smiled indulgently. 'What did she say?' 'She told us everything was okay,' his sister said, 'and she showed us her pretty yellow dress.'" Wingard paused, his face pale. "They didn't know about the dress. My parents never mentioned it, and they never saw her in it, but they described it perfectly." Wingard's story left me rattled. The intensity in his voice, the haunted look in his eyes, it all felt too real to dismiss. Years later, I couldn't shake the memory of that conversation. I looked him up and reached out. When we spoke, we seemed more subdued, older in a way that wasn't tied to age. He told me about his grandmother's experience, one that happened long after we'd parted ways. He'd been married with children, and one night, he woke suddenly to the sound of his son crying. "I went to check on him," Wingard said. "When I got to his room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Hovering just outside the door was a dense, swirling haze. It wasn't smoke, but it had weight, a presence. It pulsed, almost alive. I couldn't move," he said. "I just stood there frozen watching it. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it drifted away, straight down the hall and into the basement." When he finally managed to move, Wingard rushed to his son's room. The boy was asleep, unharmed, but the air in the room was heavy and oppressive. "I don't know what it was," he admitted, "but whatever it was, it's tied to me, or maybe to the things I've seen." Wingard's story still haunts me. It wasn't the usual ghost story with predictable twists or scares. It was raw, unsettling, and disturbingly real. A reminder that some doors, once open, can never be closed again.